All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're ready to get going with our Oxford Union-style debate. My name is Lisa Rabbe. Welcome. I think this is going to be a very spirited and exciting discussion for all of you, and we look forward to your participation actively as well. So this is an old topic with new context. We're debating the subject of EU powers to intervene in foreign takeovers. Following the rise in geopolitical risk, we've had also high cross-border acquisition activity by companies from certain jurisdictions, and the UK's recent decision to exit the EU, plus some transitions of European national governments. So we've had a few things change, even though this debate has been going on in the EU for years. And some EU country leaders have recently called afresh for the EU to be given the power to review and block takeovers by non-EU companies. The US has long operated a CFIUS regime. That stands for the Committee on Foreign Investments in the US. This is a multi-agency standing committee with a process dedicated to reviewing cross-border mergers in case they pose national security considerations. The EU has historically concentrated power over antitrust and merger control, but has never had pooled sovereign power to intervene in merger control on national security or other grounds. The EU leaders have largely left these questions to national level. And some individual EU member states have specified particular criteria. Others have done it on an ad hoc fashion. So that's a little bit by way of backdrop to the debate, but no doubt our highly esteemed group of speakers will give us further insights on these developments during the debate. So with that, may I now ask Levin Holle, we're delighted to have Levin from the German government today with us, to come and be the first speaker for the proposition.
Madam Chair, it's my great honor and pleasure as the first speaker this afternoon to introduce your guests, and I would like to start with John C. Coffey, who's the Adolph A. Burley Professor of Law on Columbia Law School. He's listed by the National Law Journal as one of the most influential lawyers, one of the top 100 most influential lawyers in the United States, and he's also the most cited professor in a very specific and unique combination of business law. To his right, you will see Peter Montagnon, who is Associate Director at the Institute of Business Ethics. Prior to this, he was a Senior Investment Advisor at the Financial Reporting Council. And before that, he was, for 20 years, Senior Journalist with the Financial Times, including responsibility in Asia, probably covering countries like China. And then from my perspective to the very right, we have Professor Ernst-Ludwig von Thadden, who is Professor of Economics and Finance at, and since October 2012, Rector of the University of Mannheim. He is Research Fellow at the Center of Economic Policy Research and several other renowned research organizations. Madam Chair, these are your guests, and they are most welcome. Now, when starting with the motion, let me start with 3 points first, one explanation and 2 confessions. The first point is I'm speaking here in a personal capacity, not in the government capacity, just for the record. And the 2 confessions I would like to make. Firstly, this is my first Oxford Union-style debate. I've been to Oxford, but I've not been to an Oxford Union-style debate. And my second confession is that if you had asked me to take part in such a debate 3 years ago, I would have been firmly on the opposition side. But witnessing what is happening in the world of trade investment over the last 3 years, I personally have changed my position, and that is why I'm glad to have the opportunity to explain here why I do believe that Brussels should have the power to block foreign takeovers. Why is that? I think there are 2 main issues to be discussed. My first point would be any sovereign should have, under certain conditions, such powers at his disposal. And the second point is, in the EU, Brussels is the right place where these powers should be located. Let me focus now on the first point. Why should sovereigns have the powers to block foreign takeovers? And I'd have four main arguments on this point. My first is, of course, the international division of labor is beneficial. Openness to foreign investment typically brings net benefits to a country, to consumers, to technological development. And you'll hear much more of these advantages, I assume, from the opposition speakers, so I can keep this part of my statement short. So it is beneficial, but I deeply believe that this is only true under several assumptions. Can we assume efficient markets or rather oligopolistic structures? Is, for example, technology transferred in such transactions and shared with home and host? Are all countries roughly equally open and cooperative rather than free riding? Is there a level playing field? And is there reciprocity when looking at investment regimes? Obviously, these assumptions cannot be taken for granted. We are facing, some may call it strategic, but certainly not fully cooperative behavior in trade and foreign direct investment. And we do see important countries exploiting loopholes in investment rules and not granting access on a reciprocal basis for foreign direct investment into their country. Secondly, I do think there are also other goods beyond purely economic interests which are important for sovereigns to preserve. Preserving security and public order can have several dimensions: national security, health, environment, to name just three. These goals, of course, may be misused for protectionist purposes. I do not want to deny that. So one has to be vigilant about how a power to block takeovers is exercised. But these goals do matter for us. The third point is, having these powers and instituting these powers under law should not be confounded with mechanic rules. Already by simply having this power available, they induce a change in behavior in other countries you deal with in your investment relationships. The fourth point is, the distinction between national security interests and economic interests may be clear in concept, at least from a government perspective, but less obvious and often blurred in practice. Technology serves both and has the potential to affect both. And there are numerous examples. I could quote the use of nuclear energy. You can speak about digitization on the one hand, and looking at my colleague from BlackRock, the risks of cyber attacks and hybrid threats to functioning financial markets. So there are many elements in this. If I had to sum up these arguments in one sentence, I would say in international direct investment, we need cooperative behavior, but we are facing increasingly over the last years, that was the main point which led me to change my position on this point, we're increasingly facing non-cooperative strategic behavior. So we do need powers to induce or encourage cooperative behavior. Allow me a short detour into economic game theory, very short. And again, I'm not a scientist and an expert on this, so forgive me for that. Trade theory is full of this, which is why I do think that strategic players have a lot to gain. But let me here just flag one famous experiment, which many of you may know. The political scientist Robert Axelrod, in order to find out a winning strategy for repeated prisoner's dilemma, conducted a computer tournament. The result of the tournament was that the simplest of all strategies attained the highest score. This strategy was called tit for tat, and it had only two rules. On the first move you do in the situation, cooperate. On the second, you do what your opponent did previously. So if he cooperated, you continue cooperation. If he defects, you do the same. As soon as he cooperates, you cooperate again. This tournament was repeated in different setups, where tit for tat ultimately displaced all other strategies and became the superior strategy. What is worth emphasizing, in my view, is that tit for tat, to be successful, requires both reciprocity and cooperation. So never be the first to the defect. Retaliate only after your partner has defected. Be prepared to forgive after carrying on. and adopt the strategy only if the probability of meeting the same player again exceeds 2/3. That's an interesting point at the end. Now, let me come back to the real world and to the elephant, or perhaps I should say the dragon in the room, which is China. There's a strong asymmetry today between the EU and China regarding the treatment of foreign investment. Chinese companies have acquired foreign targets in an astounding pace with over $30 billion only in 2016. And this is growing. 2/3 of China's listed corporates are state-owned, and so are Chinese investors in the EU, which potentially raises national security issues in addition. And while so far we have been very free, especially in Germany, in allowing takeovers, investment, and so forth, there's no reciprocity. Anybody of you who is or has been active and has experience with foreign direct investment in China knows about the long list of formal and even more importantly, informal problems, blockages, issues to be overcome if you really want to acquire a controlling stake and get your money out of the country in the case you do make profits, which is not easy in China. So the situation is clearly one where we don't have reciprocity. China is now the second largest economy in the world, is one of the largest foreign direct investors abroad, but it's one of the most restrictive countries for FDI in the world. So I think we do need a power in Europe to encourage reciprocity. Let me now come to my final point. Why should this power in Europe be located in Brussels and not with 27 or 28 member states? Around half of the EU's members today have national legislation. It stands to reason that an EU mechanism instead of national solutions would be more coherent and much more efficient. Direct investment in the EU is often motivated by the single market, so it affects more than one country. And it will be much more complex for investing firms if you have to deal with 27 or 28 different legislatures. Furthermore, since these powers are at least as much as about protecting strategic interests of the European Union as they are about ensuring cooperation and reciprocity, they are much more valuable if they're exercised at the European level. Trade policy today is already the sole competence of the European Union in negotiating. And that is why I do believe that if we have this power in Europe, which I think we should, it should be at the European level and in Brussels. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Levin. I would now like to invite John Coffey to intervene as the first speaker for the opposition. John.
My first responsibility, however, is to introduce the person who's just spoken. That may have put the ox before the horse or whatever, the cart before the horse, but that's how we do it Oxford style. And I've also been asked to introduce him in true Oxford style, which is a little bit different than you might imagine. So it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to be able to introduce Mr. Levin Holle as this first speaker, although he's already spoke, for the proposition. Okay. Over the last 24 hours, I have been approached by a number of volunteers who have made suggestions to me about interesting things to say in my introduction of Mr. Holle. These speakers were wonderfully motivated volunteers, enthusiastic, and they had all kinds of tidbits of information. My sense of prudence, however, told me I had to censor most of these because it might be beyond the bounds of propriety. And also I was aware that the German law of defamation is much stricter than is the American law, and I didn't want to cross either of those standards. So I'll just introduce him by saying the basic facts of his career. I was instructed to point out that he should be introduced as a young German lawyer. I don't understand quite why that's so evident, but all right. A young German lawyer who was born in 1967. I was already in law school as of that point, but age is relative and it's the eye of the beholder. Mr. Holle started out as a constitutional law scholar, but he had the presence of mind, intelligence, and high mobility, all of which are important for a career in public life, to quickly move out of constitutional law and into the field of finance. Finance being about as far removed from constitutional law as any field that I can think of. There, as a young expert in finance, he joined the Boston consulting firm and quickly became a partner. For non-Americans, I should tell you that Boston Consulting is an iconic name in the United States. It's extremely well known. While at Boston Consulting, he advised the German National Bank. Unfortunately, despite his astute guidance, the German National Bank encountered a period of insolvency, and that may have led him to his second move, which was moving over to the Ministry of Finance to rehabilitate and resurrect the German National Bank. You know, consultants never leave their clients, they just change their role and their title from time to time. Okay, in 2011, he received from Mr., I'm not going to mispronounce these names because I'm not a German expert, Mr. Wolfgang Schäuble made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. I have to translate those phrases for the non-Americans. That refers to a series of movies in which an offer that you can't refuse was made. And these movies were about an organization, also an NGO, perhaps not as impeccable socially as Boston Consulting, but equally able to wield power effectively. All right, and in this role, he came to the Ministry of Finance, where I'm told he has risen at very fast speed, and he has succeeded in uniting both the center-left and the center-right to back his policies, all the sign of a very successful comer. And the new Social Democrat Finance Minister, Mr. Olaf Scholz, has just confirmed his appointment to continue as the German regulator chiefly responsible for regulation of the capital markets. And as the person chiefly responsible for regulation of the capital markets, he has just explained to you why we should block takeovers as the chief rule for capital markets. Well, we can debate that a little, but he's already heard him, and so I won't go further to explain what the topic was he's going to debate. Now I will shift, and you can start your clock. I have the greatest respect for my opponents and for the debate in Europe, but I am surprised, perplexed, even dumbfounded that they are exactly faithfully mimicking, echoing, and endorsing the same position that's been put forward in the United States and belligerently implemented by one Donald Trump. I wasn't aware that Donald Trump was quite as popular as he seems to be here in Europe today, and that European leaders were going to join him in an alliance to make protectionism the new global default rule, because that's what they would be doing under this particular standard. This is a proposal before this House that has no limits, no stated rationale, no controls, no procedures, no appeal, no due process. That's exactly how Donald Trump likes things. Unfettered discretion, complete discretionary power, and absolutely no opposition or controls or appeals. But if he gets that, what you get is just what you see Donald Trump producing, the complete politicalization of the process. Okay, now what is the alternative? What am I speaking for? I think it's very important to carefully balance both national and economic security on one side and the need for foreign investment on the other. You do not carefully balance these twin principles by giving unfettered discretion to any agency without there being criteria, standards, or even a rationale. Indeed, I've got to tell you, it's sort of surprising to me because there have been lots of this legislation, both in the US, where we've had 30 years experience with it, and in many European countries. Usually this legislation comes with a small fig leaf. The fig leaf disguises total nudity, and the ugly truth that behind these proposals, there usually is the ugly fact of protectionism. There's a lot of protectionism here, and without any controls, I think this legislation is protectionism on steroids, okay? Sadly, protectionism has some history in Europe, and that history may be associated with a somewhat slower rate of economic growth in Europe and a slower rate possibly of innovation as well. Now, protectionism is not the only force here, although it's a very independent and strong force. The other force is a certain paranoia, and it's a paranoia about the Asian menace, hereafter referred to simply as China. Now, China does have a very unpopular press. I understand the evidence. Xenophobia is always a good political strategy, but not so great an economic strategy. And when I look at the policy here of opposing China, the first thing that occurs to me is, if you really want to oppose China, why do you pass legislation that would apply to a Japanese, an Australian, an American, or a UK bidder making a takeover proposal in Europe? You don't need to be that overbroad if all you're trying to do is get China to engage in greater reciprocity. I do agree. You need greater reciprocity, but this is not the way to go. China has already shown that it can totally outflank the kind of controls that are here proposed with regard to the United States. The United States has had legislation, although it requires a national security justification, it does permit a body called CFIUS in the United States to block any foreign takeover, and it's often used unwisely. That power is outflanked by China because they have simply learned not to do a takeover, but instead to do a joint venture or to do a minority investment. And the US government has admitted that this policy has totally failed in the US, and they are now passing legislation which probably will go through. I'm not certain, but probably will go through this year, under which they will prevent even a joint venture or minority investment without the approval of CFIUS. Once you go that far and say you can't spend $1 in the United States without the approval of CFIUS if you're a foreign body, you've gone pretty far to blocking foreign investment in the United States. That may not be critical to the United States. It may not be critical to France or Germany, but it's very critical to much of Europe. Countries like Greece, the Balkan states, and Hungary need foreign investment, and you're going to put great strains on the European community if we start blocking investment in some countries because of the fear of other countries that it will result in technological loss or job loss. Okay, now again, I am not disagreeing with my opponent. There is a legitimate grievance that can be directed against China. That grievance is that China doesn't play by reciprocal rules. We need reciprocity. How do you get to reciprocity? You get there by a negotiation. You get there by bilateral negotiations between the EU and China. You don't get there wisely by blocking the rest of the world from making foreign investments in Europe, and that's going to hurt those countries that most need foreign investments. Now, the answer will be given. The U.S. has done this for 30 years. Why am I opposing something the U.S. has done? The U.S. experience shows two things very clearly. One, it shows that it hasn't worked, that China has gotten around it very easily, so much so that we've confessed failure and are writing new legislation. And two, we have seen that because of this legislation, any target firm will come up with a pretext to show that it should be immune from a takeover because the foreign bidder is doing something that will disturb the public order. And anyone can come forward with a pretext. If you doubt me, let me quickly give you two examples. You may have heard that earlier this year, a company called Broadcom made and financed a $117 billion, that's not small, folks, a $117 billion offer for a company called Qualcomm. They were very similar companies that had grown up together, founded by American entrepreneurs, and both were owned 72% to 75% by U.S. institutional investors. However, for a variety of reasons, Broadcom had become incorporated in Singapore. And of course, in the minds of Mr. Trump and his allies, Singapore is only 500 miles from Beijing, so obviously a Singapore incorporated company was a stooge and a mere agent of China, and therefore his bodies blocked this acquisition, even though it was 72% owned by U.S. investors. As a result of that blockage killing the takeover, what happened? Broadcom quickly reincorporated in Delaware, moved its corporate headquarters to San Jose, and is now again a U.S. company. What this really shows is you can always come up with a pretext if you want to oppose a takeover. I am sure that countries like France, if they see some job loss, will see lots of reasons why there should be a blockage, whether it's China, Japan, Australia, the US, or England behind the takeover. Okay, now let me make one final point that goes to the second point that Mr. Holle was making. At least half of the major European nations have legislation that allows you to block a takeover on national security or economic security grounds. Why then is it necessary to give this authority to the EU? Think about the strains this will create in a post-Brexit world within the European community. Suppose that China wants to make some kind of acquisition in Greece or the Balkans, but it will have some negative impact on France. France or any other country will go to Brussels and say, you need to block this. And the entire process of mergers and acquisitions will become very politicized. We don't need to politicize it. That discourages foreign investment. And we're going to have that kind of discouragement. Moreover, we're going to have strains within the EU because Greece sees needed foreign investment blocked by another country that's concerned about job loss within its borders. We are going to have greater tension. So I come to my final concluding sentence, hopefully within my time limit. We've seen this system doesn't work in the United States. It gives rise to pretexts in almost every case to block a takeover. It politicizes the entire process. And, to put it very simply, a vote for this proposal is a vote for the policies, logic, and intellectual honesty, such as it is, of Donald Trump. He will be delighted if you favor this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So you've now heard the proposition and the opposition, and I'd now like to open the floor for debate from the audience. So please have your questions and your comments ready. We have a microphone. Who would like to go first? Xavier.
I tend to be in favor of the motion, but I think there is a problem that has not been pointed out, which is that in the European Union, on competition issues, no distinction is made between state-owned and non-state-owned firms. This is the problem, I think. How to deal with politically motivated states, which may give an advantage to firms in terms of competition, they may distort competition, when your own internal rules prevent you from doing that. Italian firms have been doing it. They are still doing it, state-owned Italian firms. So in a sense, we have a problem inside because, and then I would say, maybe we should rethink how we deal with the state-owned firms. Because the problem with China, I guess, is that the firms that do these purchases, apart from the reciprocity, well, they are state-owned and they have all the power of the state, and then this links to the reciprocity issue, right? But how do we deal with that, no? And I think that this is very much connected to the issue. I see the problem, but we already have the problem inside and we have not addressed it.
Great, thank you, Xavier. Next question. Luca.
Thank you. So I tend to be against the proposition, but I don't think it's just about China. We are going into a future in which we will have ever more possibly rogue states, Russias and possibly a North Korea that comes to the foreground, and it will not be necessarily clear where the boundaries between state-owned enterprises and privately owned enterprises are. So in Russia, you have these oligarchs who are formally owners, private owners of their own enterprise, but everyone knows, and also sanctions are applied to them because they are close to Putin. And there might be Turkey and others who may rise potentially as buyers of European firms, and there it would be hard to say, yeah, we deal with this problem by having special rules for state-owned enterprises, because you may end up favoring a regime which has the wrong values by being pro-market and open and so on.
Okay, thank you, Luca. Further questions? Lady on this side, please. Thanks.
Good afternoon. So I tend to be against this motion for the following reason. I think that what I hear as the concern for the motion is that it could lead to maybe the the dissemination of human capital and patents, etc., that one might not want in the hand of states, kind of that are competing with Europe or, other countries. But the truth is, in an M&A, at least they pay for it. And we've seen that in the past, Japan, now China, has been able, when they're not paid, to kind of help this dissemination in other ways. And so I think if what you're really after is figuring out to have reciprocity in acknowledging the intellectual property rights and the rights of different states, then I would agree with kind of the opposition that we need different levers, not the lever of blocking takeovers.
Okay, thank you. Next point. Who would like to intervene? Gentleman in the middle here, please.
Maybe this is premature because the economics professor hasn't been there yet, but there should be some numbers here, right? Because there's a trade-off between two things. This inefficiency loss that we're talking about, and this value, security, national security, whatever it is. Has anybody tried to at least quantify the inefficiency part we're talking about? That is, when we block mergers, things are not going as well in the economy as they should be. Because we can't just feel about this, right?
Okay, thank you. Further points?
Yeah, so I have an argument in favor of the proposition. The motion says this House believes that Brussels should have the power to block foreign takeovers. It does not say that Brussels should block foreign takeovers. Presumably giving oneself the power to be able to block cannot do any harm.
Okay, thank you, Marco. More points? Well, I'll David.
If I have a microphone. I mean, the problem, as usual, is political. It's not just a substantive point that, say, Mr. Holle made, that you lose, for example, intellectual property to China, where you've got a robot, biggest robot maker in Germany goes to China. There's lots of other ways China, as has been pointed out, can get hold of intellectual property. So you need engagement to try to change the rules if you can. But the problem with having a power, as Marco says, to block takeovers is that it's going to be used in inappropriate cases. And there will be vast pressure to do so. For example, it is hard to believe that at one point France was on the verge of declaring that yogurt was a sort of strategic industry. And it's only a sort of ridiculous, at least to me, ridiculous example of what will inevitably happen. There's always pressure for politicians to deal with and quell, if you like, immediate issues of topicality, but rational argument about it doesn't really fly easily in the face of that sort of populist sentiment. So I actually have some sympathy for the motion, but one has to be very clear about the rules around it and realistic about the political pressures that will arise.
Thank you, David. Do we have more points? This is a very emotive topic. I'm surprised it's not provoking a little more emotion in the audience. More points? Gentleman in the back.
I only have a question. The question is this: there seems to be agreement in this room that we need reciprocity between, take China, Europe, the US. How do we achieve reciprocity negotiating with China or others without having the power to block them? If there is no tit for tat, I'm very much skeptical that we would achieve reciprocity. So you need a tool or weapon, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Who else would like to intervene? Gentleman at the back.
So I'm not used to this style, but maybe so. I would like to first have a comment on the assumption or premises of the discussion, because what we are doing is that maybe so. Yeah, we have been based on how to say we shared in the world system, so economic system with foreign direct investment. But what maybe so the reason why we are now debating that we are having the entirely new, how they say, the participant from the little bit unknown superpower. Yeah, it's namely, so people are saying China. Of course, in the past, in Japan, so somebody mentioned, but in that case, the Japan has been obeying the economic rules, even though. So that might be different. And also, the partner player is different from the others. And another thing is the objective of the participating in the rule through the FDI sounds different, because that, namely, I don't limit it in this example, but to civil military transfer use. And who is controlling that? Again, the objective and also the way. Yes, the state-owned or maybe. So I don't think this might be properly, how to say, the describing, but maybe the party-controlled. So a little bit outside of the economic reason. That's, I think, so we need to, how to say, emphasize or notice, I think, at this moment. And again, so further than that, so maybe so I'm really expecting the further debate. But how to deal with the situation? Of course, it's now I know that FDI screening through the EU level. I think that's one of the points we've already listened. But of course, we can't neglect China. So we need to cope with that. So in that sense, we need to, how to say, the carve or maybe so educate the Chinese systems. How we do that? So that's also I've already heard one example. Theoretically, so if they knows the prisoner dilemma, they may curb the behavior. That's maybe one of the example or not final, maybe the way how we go. And the third point, finally, so what I'm learning is that reciprocity is a very dangerous word. Yes. Arguing with Mr. Trump, but reciprocity can go both ways, closing each other in the market, or FDI, exactly. No. So reciprocity is a very dangerous. So it might or it has to go to show the direction. So I think as far as I know, so at this moment in the real world, people are not using reciprocity. It might use, how to say, the direction to open up either in Chinese market or maybe so for EU market or the others like Japan or maybe other countries. That's my observation from 3 points. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that intervention. Greg?
Yeah, I was going to say...
Microphone's coming.
One of the areas that reports to me at OECD is investment and multilateral agreement on investment and foreign direct investment. So, but then corporate governance. And we're actually about to produce something on this issue, particularly with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the comments that I guess we've been discussing is, rather than if China, well, clearly the SOEs are a big issue, right, in terms of how they operate and their transparency, etc. And one of the things that I think we had a session recently on this at our investment committee on using national security interests to stop takeovers. And one of the I think recommendations that came out of that would be, if they do want to play, it probably needs to be, they've got to be able to play fairly. And one of the suggestions was that perhaps, SOEs, where there are guidelines issued by OECD, should think about almost having something like the Santiago principles that were developed for sovereign wealth funds a number of years ago, that, have the principles of transparency and proportionality, and basically trying to put them, because I think a lot of the issue is concerns about the lack of transparency of SOEs and how they're actually governed and how much they are part of the state. So that's just another aspect, I think, perhaps a more constructive way of perhaps of solving the problem. Because it's not, you think about it, there is a lot of parallels with the concern perhaps a decade ago about sovereign wealth funds buying into countries and strategic issues. So there may be some lessons there in terms of perhaps a more constructive approach, particularly where it's dealing with SOEs as an issue.
Great, thank you, Greg. Anybody else? Points before we go back for the next round of interventions? Gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. I think I tend to be against the motion at the moment, but there's a couple of examples I think that I would throw out, particularly we've seen in the UK. The most recent, after I think there was Kraft Heinz takeover of Cadbury, the UK thought that chocolate had become a matter of national security and took the power to be able to stop mergers. And the most recent one they tried to use it was actually one UK company taking over another one. So once you've got the power, as Mr. Doyle has said, the problem is that you get urged to use it in all sorts of different situations. So you need to have the rules around it so the market knows when it's going to be used and who can come and who can't come.
Okay, very good, thank you. I think that is about all the time we have, unless anybody has one last point they'd like to make. If not, then I shall invite the second speaker for the proposition, Peter Montagnon, to come and intervene. Peter.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here because I've been given the opportunity to stand behind President Trump. And you may not know this, but Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a great Englishman, and by the way, incidentally, a prominent Brexiteer, had an article in the Times 2 days ago in which he invited us all to stand behind Mr. Trump. So I am going to do my patriotic duty now as Mr. Rees-Mogg. By the way, he wants to refight the 100 Years' War because this time he thinks Britain will win it. Anyhow, I'm going to do my patriotic duty and stand behind President Trump. And I'm also rather pleased because I was a little bit worried by the gentleman who asked for numbers. And I'm not sure if you're just standing behind President Trump that you need to worry about the numbers very much, except possibly $130,000. I wonder where that went. Now, actually, this is, I think, an interesting proposition that's before us. But the trouble with it is that it's binary. It's like a sort of referendum question, actually, as it happens. And if you put a binary question through a referendum and invite knee-jerk emotional reactions, you will tend to get perverse responses. And I think what we really need to do in thinking about this is to look for the balance of arguments. This isn't something which is actually definitely right in every case or definitely wrong, but we need to look for the balance of arguments. And here I have to say, I don't think you have to agree with everything that Mr. Holle said to actually support the debate, to support the argument. I'm personally a bit skeptical about the reciprocity argument, because I think that does tend to lead to protectionism, and I just don't believe that by blocking China, you will actually make them open themselves up. They don't work like that, and it's not necessarily the right way to go. But I also think that the argument as put by Mr. Coffey here, that this is unfettered power of discretion to stop everything, all foreigners keep away, stop everything, isn't really what we mean. It's not a very sensible proposition, and I don't think anybody wants to do that. The issue which I want to focus on is national security, and you will see as what I have to say unfolds what I mean by that. But I want to start by saying that actually, if you are going to have the power to block takeovers for national security reasons, it really does make sense that that power should be capable of being exercised at the European level because of the single market. It's just not really very sensible to let something like that just reside at national levels when you've got a single market. It's a contradiction. Now, I think there may be, and I'm not a lawyer here, but I think there may be some legal issues, because I think in the WTO, it's national security, not some form of supranational security, which provides exemptions. And one might have to get round that. But the logic is that some power should reside, if you're going to do this, at the European Union level. And I think it is also worth making the point that the European Union is now itself increasingly preoccupied with security issues. So that sort of seems to fit together with that debate. I think this is also, I think one wants to say quickly, not necessarily just about China, although I'm going to talk about China in a minute. It's not necessarily just about state-owned companies, because there are countries which have been mentioned in the debate, Russia and Turkey, whose companies might actually come up with propositions that might have a security connection. But the important thing is, it's about security. And there are security dimensions in the modern world which we weren't used to having before. So let's take a country or company from a country like, for example, China, that buys a data company in the EU that, because of the single market, has access to EU-wide data, and then actually tries to use that data in processing it for what might be described as hostile purposes. Now, that's something you do need to consider, because it would be very difficult using in the single market to stop it acquiring data inside the European Union. It would be quite difficult to enforce regulations on the treatment of data when it was being taken away and processed in China, but the access to the data came from the fact of the takeover. And I think there you can begin to see the case for a national security or a security reason for blocking the takeover. Or you might look at the purchase of a company used for security printing in the European Union that actually would, because of the single market, be able to market its services all over the European Union, but actually whose activity might present some kind of security risk to other member states or citizens of other member states. So I think the issue really is not whether there should be EU competence in this. The issue is how far should it go, how should it be designed, and what should be the conditions. Now, I want to lay out some which I think support the case. Remember, what we need to say, the EU should have the power, as Mark has suggested, to block takeovers. That's all the sentence says. It doesn't say anything in the sentence about conditions, but we can impose some. And my first one is that must be a real security risk. All this stuff about chocolate and yogurt being national security issues is rubbish. It's for the birds. Well, birds like to peck at yogurt, I'm quite sure. But it's actually got to have a really clearly definable security connection before the power can be used. Secondly, we would need to consider how the European Commission or the European institutions shared the competence with the member states. Because the question is, does this come up from a member state which has got a security interest, which then the other member states agree is a genuine security interest, and therefore the thing can be blocked? Does it actually come from somebody in Brussels deciding, oh, we don't like that one, let's keep them out? Because that's quite different. So we need to have very clear processes, and including also questions about whether such decisions would have to be put to a council vote. The next thing is, I think there would need to be some provision for judicial review. And the European Court of Justice, which I have to say as a British person, I think is a supremely wonderful organisation and should be preserved and should go from strength to strength when troublemakers leave it. So I think the European Court of Justice, or somebody like that, should actually be, there should be recourse to judicial review. That would provide some safeguards. So you've got to have real security risk. The EU Commission's powers have got to be very clearly set out, and including in relation to their in relation to the member states, and you need a judicial review. Now, just a few words about CFIUS, because obviously this has been going on in America for a long time, and the CFIUS has been used to block takeovers on reasons which are not really security related. In America, the government is very vulnerable to lobbying by companies. If you have a matrix here of different interests, and John Coffey has said the Greeks might not like their investment to be blocked in their country, although the Syriza government doesn't like foreign investment at all and has had to actually sort of hold its nose and blindfold itself to allow foreign investment in the wake of the crisis. But I mean, there would be people who would want the investment. There would be people who would not want their markets to be disrupted by protectionist interference. There would be people who would want to block takeovers. So you'd actually probably have a much more rounded debate than you get in the single country situation with a single capital where people are much more vulnerable to lobbying. So I think the Europe, this is one of those things actually which Europe could do better than America. It's one of the many things Europe could do better than America. And for all those reasons, I do urge you to support the motion, but bearing in mind that we're actually looking for a balance of arguments, not unfettered power as the opposition suggested. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Peter. And now I call Ernst-Ludwig von Thadden, second speaker for the opposition.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for using Chinese technology here, but it's just in general more convenient, although I admit today paper is of course good. European paper would have been better, but I didn't have a printer with me. It's a great pleasure to be able to discuss comes from China. Who cares? I mean, you know this, free trade is optimum. Great pleasure to be able to discuss here and to be the final speaker in this argument. And as it was noted before by the gentleman in the middle, the opera is not over until the fat lady sings, or in this case, until the economist speaks. And I just have to disappoint you. I won't give you data, but I will give you something else, principles. And that's what economists can do as well. So, Peter, let me just come back to your brilliant speech. I was not sure whether you were speaking for or against the proposition, unfortunately. I came out of your introduction with a profound sense that you have a Brexit trauma. Not making binary decisions is, of course, a good idea, but sometimes you have to, and here we are asked to defend a position or not. Brussels may get it wrong. Yes, we would have to balance the arguments, etc., etc. The Greeks may not like the Chinese to build up the harbor in Piraeus, etc., etc. Yes, I mean, this is all a real problem, and thanks for bringing it up so I don't have to repeat it. Let me just sort of play the economist's role here very forcefully and clean up a little bit our intellectual stance. I mean, there is one very clear-cut proposition in economics. There are very few, but there is one. Free trade is good, and this comprises the flow of goods, services, and capital. This is a dominant view. Some may call it neoclassical. I would just call it classic. This is Ricardo, Heckscher, Orlean, Krugman, Obstfeld, Mellitz. This is what economics has been arguing in many different ways, and it has been shown to be very rich in its implications. So Levin and Peter say this is not so. And Levin and Peter are honorable men. So why would they think so? Did they have distributional consequences in mind? When preparing this talk this morning in the train from Mannheim to Berlin, I would think that is the argument they would make. No, this is, I think, to me, the most powerful intellectual challenge to the traditional Ricardian model. There's distributional consequences, and we can't handle them as domestic governments, and therefore we must be careful. Interestingly enough, they have not really argued along those lines, although at one or two points this argument surfaced. And it's not, of course, it's not really surprising. I mean, Levin from the German Ministry of Finance is, of course, in a certain school. I mean, you have the representative German household and the representative German firm in mind, and rightly so. In a functioning division of governmental labor, distributional aspects are better left to the ministries of labor and social affairs or whatever. I mean, if you have a functioning government, but I mean, we do seem to have one now. And so, I mean, understandably, and I would take that point of view, but then we're again back in the classic world of Ricardo, Hector-Ohlin, Obstfeld, Krugman, and all the others. So we're again back in this world, and still, Levin and Peter say capital should not move freely. So what is the argument? And the argument seems to be that foreign capital that is invested in firms should be treated differently from other capital. Remember, capital should flow freely. This is the original proposition. So put it simply, equity is not capital when it comes to international economics. That seems to be interesting. As an economist, I'm skeptical when people claim that economic laws only hold subject to specific government qualifications. As Europeans, we are in fact currently learning quite painfully this is particularly suspicious when it comes to international trade. So when you look up the textbook on the issue, Kaufmann, Krugman, Obstfeld, and Mellitz, I'm sorry. There's one passage there that's quite interesting to remember. The range of circumstances under which international trade is beneficial is much wider than most people imagine. I mean, Levin and Peter are not most people, and their imagination is wide, and so why should equity not flow freely across borders? Of course, I mean, to make an argument that goes beyond standard trade theory, one would probably have to keep in mind that equity is something much more complicated than just a bundle of goods or capital goods. No? Equity comes with control rights, equity comes with the right to intervene in decisions of individual firms, and therefore these financial returns that are being transferred by selling equity are endogenous. And so equity gives the owners proprietary information and technology knowledge and strategic decisions, which they can use to their own advantage. And to the disadvantage of whom? I mean, of course they would use it to their own advantage. But I mean, this is what free trade is about. You decide what is in your own, to your own advantage, and hopefully it doesn't hurt somebody else. So you have to identify who is being hurt. Who would that be? The other firm, the firm you're owning, would you hurt that? Their employees? Domestic national security? A couple of things that might come to mind, I'm not sure. Domestic national security has been discussed by Peter again. I think the Brexit trauma made him sort of give the opposite argument already. So let me try to figure out what in fact may hurt. And since we don't have a good theory about this, let me sort of go to specific observations. And of course, let me do what we all have in mind. Let me turn to China. And since I'm from Germany, so that's the debate I know best, Germany versus China here. So Chinese investors in Germany. So let's just look at a few examples. We have Krauss Maffei, the famous machine tool maker in Munich, taken over by Chem China for 1 billion euros in 2016. Machine tools, so this is what Germans really like. KUKA, the industrial robots maker in Augsburg, bought by Midea in 2016 for 4.5 billion. You have ISTA, a real estate service firm in Essen, bought by CKI in Hong Kong for more than 4 billion euros in 2017. And there are literally hundreds of other examples. So when you look at the German commercial industrial map today, you will find hundreds of spots where Chinese firms have large ownership stakes or 100% owners. And it's interesting to look at the reaction in Germany, because when you look at what has been said about this, you have typically the case that the German owners or managers of these firms have welcomed the takeover, and not only for financial reasons, but for strategic reasons. And the key arguments have always been access to the Chinese market for themselves, long-term relations between the investor, the Chinese investor, and the firm, and mutual benefits. So this is quite consistent with Ricardo and all the friends I cited earlier. On the other hand, there's a striking difference between the assessment of politicians and business. The politicians in Germany, and I'm certainly not referring to government administrative high flyers like Levin and others, so politicians who are not very knowledgeable of these things, they see the danger of foreign interference, industrial espionage, German deindustrialization, and eventual doom and foreign domination. So very pessimistic. Business, on the other side, sees opportunities, sees mutual benefits, sees the expanded market. So does that basic debate make me change my mind about the general value of the theory of Ricardo and the next 200 years of economic theory? No, not actually. And let me conclude with 2 or 3 specific quotes which I picked up from a newspaper some time ago, which looked into the issue and sort of was wondering, why don't the Germans, where it matters, don't bother about the Chinese? So at the 180th birthday of the Krauss-Maffei firm, the famous machine tool maker that I mentioned a few weeks ago or a few months ago in Munich, the CEO of Krauss-Maffei, CEO Frank Stieler, said that Krauss-Maffei has returned to an owner who includes his firms and employees into his family, and for whom the future of our firm is dear to his heart. That was 2 years after the takeover. The CEO of ChemChina, Ren Jianqing, said, "The giant ocean absorbs hundreds of rivers, and it is so huge because it can absorb so much." Isn't that beautiful? When we came to the KUKA takeover, remember, the robot maker, the technology of the future, Germany. That quote?
That's it, that's 10.
That quote or 10? The quote from KUKA. KUKA supervisory trade union member, Michael Lepek. "We have long-term agreements ranging from production sites and employment to IT and IT security, and we are very positive." Trade union member, supervisory board, KUKA. So why should we interrupt this happy family business?
So would the first 2 speakers like to exercise their right to rebuttal? You have 5 minutes. I invite the speaker for the proposition first.
Thank you very much, and I'll try to be brief. I cannot answer all the questions and the points made. I thought it was a very interesting debate. I had a bit the feeling that you were told by the opponents that you should oppose the motion because otherwise you would feel like President Donald Trump or you would suffer from Brexit trauma. I think those should not be the key arguments to inform your position and your vote on this point. I think you should really look at the underlying issues. And I think Peter outlined very well why there's a very clear case, and indeed most countries in the world use it, for clear and narrowly defined national security issues. I think that case, in my view, is very clear. You can argue around the question, how far do you define that and how do you control this? But I don't want to make any further arguments on this. I think the more difficult part is the one around China and reciprocity. And I think what you said was there is an issue with China. I think most of you share the sentiment. We need to negotiate. I don't want to quote Donald Trump, but I'd like to quote another US president who said, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." The question is, what sort of stick do you need for these negotiations? And I think you do need a stick. And the threat of being able to block takeovers in certain conditions coming from countries where there's no reciprocity, which do not allow equally free access of foreign direct investment, is important. So for me, the key question is indeed, how do you frame the discretion? And I'd see 2 key points here. I think the first point what we that you look at this from a macroeconomic perspective. So you say this power is only granted in situations where a body has determined that the economy the bid is originating from is not operating on a level playing field. So you take out Japan and all these other countries where you have no issue, but you said there's a specific country where we have repeatedly and massive issues. So we put that on the list where blockage is possible. Of course, that should be subject to judicial review and all the other instruments Peter managed. And I think the other important point is, and I'm concerned about what are the risks of politicization, and I know how they work. I'm part of the machine, so I'm very aware of them. But I think if the best possible model to deal with these I've seen so far on the European continent is indeed to put this power to Brussels. It has worked pretty well very well in competition. It has worked reasonably well with state aid cases. So I do have some trust that it could also work in this situation. And that is why I'd ask you to vote for the proposition. Thank you very much.
I have been emphasizing that there are two issues, protectionism and fear of China. 90% of the discussion has been fear of China. Let me just go back for a minute to protectionism. On protectionism, there's a long European history, and under this proposal, every single takeover will lead the target firm, who has a great stake involved, to try to lobby for protection. And it's uncharted territory. Nothing is specified here to limit the authority of some bureaucrat in Brussels, and France and Germany will be protecting their local industries. Other countries may desperately need foreign investment. Protectionism is going to add to the cost of the entire process. We've seen that in the US. Now, on China, I agree that the debate can be stated as what kind of stick do you need to use to get China to recognize the need for reciprocity? This is the worst possible stick. It's been seen in the United States where CFIUS didn't work, where China gets the technology it wants by other means. I'm going to be the legal realist here and say China is able to get the technology it wants. Sometimes it does this through espionage, sometimes through bribery, sometimes through takeovers, sometimes through joint ventures, sometimes through minority acquisitions. All of those techniques work. They preferred the least costly one. Takeovers are the most costly way. They're used relatively seldom by China. So if your stick is, we'll say you can't make a costly takeover that you don't need to make to get the technology you want, I don't think you effectively threaten China. I think what you've got to do is say there has to be bilateral negotiations if you want to enter the EU in almost any way, and those negotiations should cover not simply takeovers. For example, China steals American movies before they're released. They're showing in China before they're showing in the United States. That's the kind of area where you need to get firmer recognition of intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights are more important than worrying about takeovers. So you need that bilateral negotiation. If Russia is bad, you need negotiations with them too, but let's just stick with China, all right? The argument's made by some that, well, there's no danger in having this power because this power won't mean anything until it's exercised. Not true. Every target company will try to lobby like mad to see if it can avoid a takeover. It's life or death for it. Now, finally, this debate has been turned into three positions: pro, con, and Peter's modification that we should have this power if we have elaborate controls, judicial review, or if it was just said by Mr. Levin Holle that, well, we can take companies like Japan totally off the list. That's not the proposition before you. The proposition before you is unfettered power, and we'll make up the rules as we go. I think you should wait and make the rules first, and you should try to deal with China as a special problem that transcends takeovers. It's really about the protection of intellectual property across the board. That requires bilateral negotiations on a high level. Thus, I think you have a strategy destined to failure and destined to raise costs. When that British company in 2020 wants to make a takeover of a Dutch company, there might be many reasons to block this, but not national security. And that reason, however, will be used because it's in the desperate interest of the takeover target to use it. So you have something with no controls, no due process, not even a stated rationale, and you're going to endorse this when it won't be an effective threat at all to China. I don't think that's a smart way to go. And I again will tell you, the only one who thinks this technique works is a certain president over the United States who is rapidly, heavily pushing Congress to adapt an even broader prohibition on any kind of foreign acquisition. Okay, thank you.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, and I am now turning back to you, the audience, to make up your minds. It is now your opportunity to vote, so I declare the debate closed, and we will be voting by show of hands. So I would like to ask those audience members who would like to vote in favor of the proposition, and the proposition, to repeat the motion, is this House believes that Brussels should have the power to block foreign takeovers. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Thank you. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hands. Has anybody voted twice? Do we need to count? Okay. All those in favor, raise your hands, please. 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 audience members. And I'm sorry, how many? 2, yes, 14, 15. But you're going to cancel each other out anyway, gentlemen. Okay, sorry, one more time, hands up. 13, 1. Oh, more hands. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I'm sorry. We had 13 pro, so now those opposed, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So the motion is, 17. One late breaking. The motion is not carried. So thank you all, and please join me in thanking our marvelous speakers for putting forward such fascinating arguments. I hope you enjoyed the debate.